Hello, and welcome to the Roundtable number 56. I'm Gonzalo Lira, and I'm speaking to you live with Tarik, Cyril, Amar. Tarik, how's it going? Good to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Doing great now that you guys are here. And Alexander Mercouris from the Duran out in London. How's it going, Alexander? Good to see you again.
It's been going great, and it's wonderful to be here with you again, Gonzalo. And I'm sure we're going to have an outstanding program. First time for me with Tarik, and it's a huge privilege and honor to be on a program with Tarik. Can I just say?
Oh, likewise.
Yeah, what we were talking about before the start of the broadcast was Lavrov's speech at the UN Security Council. Unfortunately, I was not able to read up on or actually see the broadcast. But Alexander is on top of that. Alexander, could you give what did he say anyway? I mean, look, just before I get started on this, or I'll let you get started on it. You know, the thing that I found unconscionable is that the Western media just ignored him, and the American diplomats walked out. I mean, what the hell? This is childish behavior. This is schoolyard stuff, or it's the kind of attitude that you would do if you were at war with that country. I mean, what was going on? And first of all, what did Lavrov say?
Well, what he said was the things that he's said many times and what the Russians are now saying all the time. I mean, he didn't say anything. He didn't break, from my point of view, any particular new ground. I mean, he talked about the situation, conflict. He explained that the Russians were acting defensively. He explained that the Western powers had been pushing on the Russians, over many years. He spoke about the changes in the international system, about the fact that, the Western powers are no longer as much in control as they were. These are things that he said many times on many occasions. What was most interesting about the Security Council meeting was exactly the point that you made. It was not what he said, but how he was received. And first of all, you had the Western powers. They've been throwing an extraordinary tantrum about the fact that the Russians are chairing the Security Council at all. Now, this is a standard procedure. The members of the Security Council rotate the chairmanship on a fairly regular basis. There's absolutely nothing new about this. There's nothing unusual. It's completely, the routine stuff. And there's no evidence that the Russians are abusing their chairmanship of the Security Council. But firstly, the Americans slow-walked the granting of visas to Lavrov and his team, which is, I think, in my opinion, it's already a big abuse of the fact that the US is hosting the UN. Then they failed to grant visas to his press team, the people, the press, the Russian media, the Russian press team, which is, I mean, that's pretty ugly. That's very, very bad. Childish. Then there was a media campaign about, is it outrageous that the Russians are chairing this Security Council meeting at all? And then you had all these childish, petulant walkouts.
By the way,
that is going on.
A quick question. The Security Council chairmanship rotates on a regular basis, right? It's not an election or anything. It's a fixed rotational basis. Is that correct?
It's a fixed rotational thing. That's all. There's nothing. There's nothing more to it than that. It's a non-issue. Yeah. It's a complete non-issue. It doesn't affect the Security Council's work in any substantive way. It doesn't mean that the Russians are going to get resolutions passed or anything of that kind. I mean,
a quick question to that point. As the chairman of the Security Council, he does not have any kind of control insofar as, I mean, there are lots of chairmanships where they have a great deal of power insofar as, which to bring up for review and which issues to just sideline. There is no such power for it's more.
They can do. Right? They can do that to a limited degree. But remember, if you're a member of the Security Council, you can come to the Security Council and ask for a topic to be discussed. I mean, any member, both permanent and non-permanent, can do that. If the chair doesn't want it to be discussed, then the other members can gang up on the chair and force a discussion. So I mean, there isn't that degree of control that you can get in some organizations. It's not exactly a courtesy. It's a task, but it's a very simple task. But anyway, they walk out of the session, but then we also have film of everybody else, all the non-Western powers, all their people gathering, circling around Lavrov, wanting to meet him, wanting to shake his hand, talking to him. So in effect, what they set out to try and do, the Western powers tried to do, was to again create this image of the Russians being isolated. And the imagery of the session actually ended up showing the contrary. At least that's my view. It showed the Western powers looking petulant and childish, and Lavrov surrounded by friends. More interesting than what he said on the Security Council was what he said in a follow-up press conference, in which he said that Western policy about Ukraine has become absolutely schizophrenic. On the one hand, they're saying they're going to arm Ukraine and encourage it to launch this offensive. At the same time, they said once the offensive is out of the way and Ukraine has won all this new territory, then they will ask Ukraine to negotiate. And Lavrov said that is absurd on its face. The reason this conflict in Ukraine began at all is because we perceived a threat to ourselves from the territory of Ukraine. If this offensive were to achieve all the results the Western powers say, all that would mean is that the threat for us would be greater and our countermeasures would be stronger. So it's not going to lead to peace, it's going to lead to more war. That was what he said at his press conference. I want to stress he wasn't giving any indication that the Russians expect this offensive to succeed. He was simply pointing out, again, the complete illogic of the Western position.
Yeah. Tarik, what do you think of this?
Well, first of all, I can only agree that the way that the USA and their immediate followers, the so-called West, that they've treated this chairmanship by Lavrov and his coming to the UN, it's childish, and it's also very counterproductive from their own point of view, because what they're demonstrating is that in their understanding of this vague rule-bound order that they want, formal procedures, laws, rules that are actually written down and have been agreed on, right, signed up to, don't matter or shouldn't matter, right? That's the essence of this complaint. We have specific procedural rules here, and they're there for a very good reason. I would argue they're there especially for situations of enormous tension, including conflict, so that even during conflict, you have an agreement how at least you can keep talking to each other. That's the whole idea behind this, right? Not the whole one, but a very important part of it. And by attacking that with petty operations like withholding visa, which is basically sort of a harassment, right? It's ridiculous. Or walking out and all that stuff, you're essentially showing once again what the USA and unfortunately a lot of Europeans, I mean EUians, if you want, have been shown recently again and again, that they have, and this is my kind way of expressing it, they have a totally atrophied idea of diplomacy. They literally don't know what diplomacy is any longer, right? Diplomacy meets its challenge when you have hard issues to deal with. That's exactly when you don't shut it down, right? And ideally, you should maintain diplomacy at some level, even during war, right? Not to speak of this weird mixture of war, proxy war that we are seeing now. Of course, diplomacy should be going on. The only mitigating thought I can have about all this, playing to the gallery, this showmanship that they're producing instead, is that I hope that there are secret channels operating at the same time. I very much hope somebody is still talking seriously to somebody between these two, right? And what they're doing there is essentially theatrics. But if it comes down to theatrics, and I think Alex made the same point, even in theatrics, this isn't working well. This is working actually very badly. It's not even a good show for the Americans. It's inexplicable how they come there, right?
No, I think that I think it's not theater. I think that they don't have any kind of back channel communications, except perhaps the Pentagon having some sort of deconfliction line or something like that. But
Look,
I don't think that any kind of serious diplomatic effort is
Gonzalo,
being
that
made.
might be true. I'm expressing a hope, right? And I'm very used to my hopes being disappointed. I mean, until this war escalated in February last year, I hoped that they would start negotiating instead of actually fighting it out, and they didn't, right? So I'm not saying they necessarily have back channels, right? But right now they seem to be people like Biden and Austin and Blinken and Newland. I think they're capable of not having back channels, at least not at a sufficiently high level, but I don't know, right?
Well, the Russians have said that there are no back channels. Now, of course, they may not be telling the truth. The Russians don't always tell the truth, but they are saying that if there are actually no back channels at the moment between themselves and the West,
why would they lie?
And it is and why would they lie? Now, they were very badly burnt because back in the autumn there was an attempt to set up what looked like a back channel, which is that Burns, who's the CIA director, met Narishkin, who was the foreign minister, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Russia. They set up a meeting in Ankara, and the Russians agreed to this meeting, and it was supposed to be a hush-hush secret meeting, and then almost immediately reports about it began to circulate, and it turned out that when the meeting took place, all that happened was that Burns basically spoke the official line. He didn't communicate anything with the Russians at all. And that's apparently made the Russians nervous of more back channels. But there aren't apparently, according to the Russians, any back channels. If I can say something about what Tarik said, the thing about this administration is it doesn't do diplomacy at all.
Mm-hmm.
The US is not talking to Russia, which is a nuclear superpower. It's not talking to China either, which is a nuclear superpower. The Chinese are talking to everybody, but they're not talking to the United States. They won't speak to Biden. They've said already that, they don't trust what Biden says. They won't receive Secretary Blinken in Beijing. And they won't pick up the phone when Lloyd Austin calls. And the Chinese foreign minister explained why. He said, what is the point of talking to people who always lie to you? He actually said that.
That's incredible that they just flat out said so. By the way, what do you think of this kerfuffle, Alexander, about the French, the Chinese ambassador to France and that whole kerfuffle? I think again that they're trying to make a mountain out of a molehill. I mean, it's like they're by whatever the Chinese or the Russians say. This is my perception, and I'd like you both to comment on as to whether you think this perception is accurate or not. Whenever any Chinese or Russian official says anything, the sky is blue, it's raining, it'll rain tomorrow, automatically they try to twist it around to paint them in the most negative light imaginable, burning any possibility of having any conversation. Does that seem to be what is going on here? That whatever they say, they'll just try to blow it up and try to cast as negative light as possible on the Chinese and the Russians. Alexander,
absolutely. I think that's exactly true. I did think the Chinese ambassador's comments were interesting, and I'll tell you why. I don't think he was setting out official Chinese policy. I think he went completely off script. But I think what he did is that he expressed views which are probably privately held by quite a lot of people in Beijing. The things that they talk to each other, because people do talk to each other, in the corridors of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, in the Central Committee, in all those sort of places. So he said, the story with Crimea is it was transferred to Ukraine by Khrushchev back in 1954. That, by the way, is true. That it has a long history of being part of Russia. That, by the way, is also true. So what's the big deal about that? But then he also, of course, said, well, some of these republics that emerged out of the wreckage of the Soviet Union, well, they've never been completely established how they came about, and there's no clear document setting out, what their real sovereignty is. Now, that was, I think he went much too far in terms of what the Chinese foreign ministry wanted him to say when he said that. And of course, probably what's been going on in China, in Beijing, is that they've been discussing with themselves this issue of Ukraine's borders. I mean, that's really what it looks to me that was all about. But he went too far. But it's not Chinese policy. It's not at the moment. It might eventually become that, but it's not Chinese policy at the moment. At worst, at the absolute worst, it was a Freudian slip by one official. But outrage, horror, have him recalled, have him declared persona non grata. This shows, that China is siding with Russia in this war. All those extraordinary things. Wild overreaction. And why this overreaction? Why this nervousness? The fact that the Western powers do overreact to these kind of off-the-cuff comments clearly shows how nervous about the situation they become.
Yeah, Tarik, what do you think?
I agree with the analysis that there are really two parts, if I understand you correctly, to what the ambassador said, which is on one side, there is his description, if you want, of what happened in the case of Crimea. And on the other side, there is this statement about, well, all these successor states, we don't really know how they have been certified, right? That's almost what he was saying. And I totally agree with you. The second part is the one that's not tenable, right? That's where he completely misspoke for a diplomat. I also agree with you that there was an astonishing degree of overreaction. And let me compare this, right? You probably remember that there was an incident where the current foreign minister, not some ambassador, the foreign minister of Germany, Annalena Baerbock, explicitly stated in the EU in a discussion that we are at war with Russia. You remember that, right?
Yeah.
So this was the foreign minister. This was not some ambassador, right? The response to that within the EU, within a lot of the German public, was to circle the wagons and explain it away and say, well, she didn't mean it, and it's not what she said is actually not what she said. Nobody was allowed, or you were allowed to, but it didn't go anywhere, to raise the obvious question, well, if she misspeaks like that, right, is she in the right position? I personally think a foreign minister who in a situation like that basically declares war should be dismissed immediately, should actually step down, him or herself. So I agree with you on 2 points. One is there's the second part where the Chinese ambassador clearly overstepped, and I don't know why. But there also is a way in which this was then exploited to the maximum extent. And I don't think this is simply a question of the West in general in this case. I also think it's a question of him actually tragicomically delivering an excellent platform for the Baltic countries, for instance, who just leap at stuff like that, because part of the political capital that they're exploiting inside the West, inside NATO, inside the EU, is this constant self-depiction as victims. I'm sorry to put it that bluntly, right? And if you get a comment like that from a rising power like China, even if it's, in quotation marks, only an ambassador, well, obviously for them that's a holiday and they're going to use it. But if you compare the two cases, Baerbock and him, I knew his name, but I can't remember it right now, I'm blanking. But if you compare the two cases, you see how biased the response to misspeaking is. And it's biased clearly by our own preferences and by our own policies, once again.
That's entirely.
Yeah, because
I completely agree.
Yeah, because I don't think that the ambassador, he has not been recalled by the Chinese, right?
No.
Not to my knowledge. No.
So if he isn't being recalled by the Chinese, then essentially they're just going to let it stand. And Alexander, I think that you're probably right that it is the thinking within a good deal of the Chinese foreign ministry. But of course, it wasn't calling for the eradication of these republics. It was just, because they're working with what they got.
Can I add one thing here?
Sure.
I mean, the way we are discussing this now, it brings to mind, to an extent, the Chinese 12-point peace plan. Well, they don't call it peace plan, I know, but essentially it's sort of the basis for a peace plan. And what's interesting about this, everybody has pointed out that I think the first point says, clearly territorial integrity, sovereignty, and so on. But when you go through all the points, there is no moment at which it says to resolve this conflict, Russia must evacuate all the territories that are part of Ukraine. It doesn't say that explicitly anywhere. Instead, the stress is on ceasefire and negotiations all the time. And then there is a variety of issues that they go through, nuclear stuff, blah, 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 blah. So I'm not sure that I would surmise from what the ambassador said that, somebody in Beijing is thinking like, in an extremely revisionist way about all of these states and their borders. But what I could imagine is that people in Beijing accept that the territorial status of Ukraine may become an issue of compromise, right? Which is what we in the West don't accept, and what Ukraine also officially doesn't accept, maybe cannot accept at this point.
I think that's exactly correct. That was my impression. Actually, I think that he was talking about Ukraine. He was not thinking about the Baltic states. The whole discussion ultimately was about Ukraine and about where Ukraine's proper borders are. Now, as I said, he went too far. He wasn't supposed to say those things in the public way that he did. But I think that the Chinese are quietly coming round to the view that Ukraine, within its 1991 borders, is simply not a viable entity, and that they're preparing to work slowly and steadily towards adjusting that and taking into account the realities. And I'm sure that's been talked about in Beijing, as I said, in the corridors of the foreign ministry and other places. But as I said, he was not supposed to say that now.
If I may, let me put a slightly personal accent on this. I agree with you mostly. I would, and one thing I would differ, where I would say, whatever China is thinking, right? I would argue that there is no reason to think that Ukraine in the borders as they emerged in 1991 would not have been viable, right? For quite a while it was viable. But, and I think this to me is the decisive point right now, because we need to think about where we are now, actually. Right now, my guess is that realists, and maybe not only in China, come to the conclusion that reestablishing precisely that territory has a lower priority than coming to peace. I think that's what's happening right now.
Oh, I agree. But again, I agree with that entirely. I mean, had the situation in Ukraine remained stable, or the kind of political suspended animation that it was in before 2014, yes, keep it together as it was. China was not seeking to change that. But the reality is things have changed so radically since then that, as we say in England, putting Humpty Dumpty together again after he's had his great fall, in other words, putting all these pieces together again and pretending that what you patch up is viable, that isn't a practical solution. And you can see, you can actually, if you track his statements, you can see what he's thinking. He says, look, Crimea, that obviously can't go back to Ukraine. It was part of Russia originally. There's a funny way in which it ended up in Ukraine. Maybe it was correct that it was in Ukraine before, but it can't realistically go back to Ukraine now. And I think if you scratch the Chinese enough, they'll probably come along and say the same is true about Donbass and other places, that the trouble, the difficulty of recreating that sort of Ukraine is simply not. It would simply
as a
be
practical matter,
a perpetuation of the conflict in order to try to achieve it. I should say I've seen Chinese maps, and they've been appearing in social media. They're not officially endorsed by the Chinese government, but then you never quite know what these maps, where they come from. But they show a Ukraine divided into three sections. One is the four regions that the Russians have taken control, have claimed as part of Russia. And these maps show these four regions fully as part of Russia. Then there is a big demilitarized zone east of the Dnieper River, encompassing Kharkiv, where Gonzalo now is. And then there's the rest. So nobody can say whether or not these maps, as I said, originate from within the Chinese government. Maybe they don't. But it did occur to me that perhaps they are again a balloon being floated, telling us, what the Chinese might be thinking. It's always important to remember, though, that the Chinese have their ideas. Doesn't follow that these ideas will ever be implemented, because the Chinese, and I think we should come to Xi Jinping's conversation with Zelensky in a moment. But the Chinese can come along and say to the Ukrainians, look, be sensible, don't put all your faith in the Americans. They're leading you up the garden path. You're risking the future of your country by doing what you're doing. We're prepared to help you get out of this mess if you let us do that. The problem is, if the Ukrainians won't let the Chinese do that, then whatever Chinese proposals there might potentially be cannot be realized, because they can't be realized without Ukraine.
May I add 2 points, maybe, because they're direct response. One is that, my impression is, and it's a very superficial impression, obviously, but my impression is that when you look at the way that the de facto basis of a peace plan proposal that the Chinese launched in these 12 points has been formulated, when you look at the readout on the Chinese side from the talk with Zelensky, I know we're going to talk about this in a minute, that the Chinese are not making the mistake of being too specific, that
Absolutely.
They actually are not overexposing themselves and acting actually very unwisely and in nobody's interests by saying we have this and that idea and this is where the borders will be and this is how we do it, right? It's a much more abstract approach, as it were. And I think that is actually serving the warring parties better. And that is also, I'm sure the Chinese have their own reasons to do it this way, but I think it's objectively better as an approach to peacemaking, to actually be quite flexible and open, right? Especially when you come in as a mediator. But the other thing I want to say is, when we think about the question of viability, there is another one that is sort of concerning, which is, what is the viability of any cessation of hostilities, or if we get really lucky, of peace? What is the viability, right? And recently there's been an extremely interesting talk by, the historian Steve Kotkin in the United States. And I was listening to it with great interest, not only because he used to be my doctoral supervisor a long time ago, but because of what he was saying. And he's now at Hoover, and he gives this big talk, and he says, look, what's the nature of peace so that it can last? And what he was actually saying, I'm summarizing, is that for peace that can last, it may be necessary to abandon some of the territories, whether that means only Crimea or something else as well, that are part of Ukraine. He's actually saying that, right? Somebody who's now based at the Hoover Institution, which I found extremely interesting. He was saying it may be necessary to give Ukraine, as a reward for going along, expedited EU membership. It's an old idea that is floating up again. And he was also saying it is necessary to give Ukraine military guarantees, but he's not mentioning NATO. right? So I don't think it's only the Chinese. I have an impression there are some people, even in the West, who are not coming from a pro-Russian position at all, right? Who are coming to the realization that it may be necessary to find a compromise, and that this old line that the Biden administration has been telling us about, which is we support them with whatever they need, but they decide all the policies on their own, right? They only talk when they want to talk, and they define all their aims absolutely on their own, which of course has never been believable. This is just not how it works. That this line has to be abandoned even formally. And you got very similar comments from Robert Haas, just more brutal, where he says, well, this is essentially costing a lot of money. We, the United States, have other commitments, and maybe it's time to wind this down. He didn't use these phrases, but that's what he was saying, right? So the viability of peace, I think, is something that is slowly dawning on people as an important thing. How do you get to something that will actually last and not lead to the next Russia-Ukrainian war in 3 years' time, and then in 6 years' time, and then another one in 10 years' time, right?
So that's why I think that, I mean, this conversation we're having, we're talking about China, we're talking about the West, but ultimately, the people who decide this are the Russians. And my thinking is that the idea of creating a demilitarized zone to the east of the Dnieper, including Kharkov and Sumy, and having Ukraine be everything essentially west of the Dnieper, with Kiev as the capital. Well, from the Russian point of view, that would mean NATO is just going to flood it with weapons, and we're going to be right back here where we started in a few years. So let's get the job done now. I mean, once they annex the 4 regions, my thinking has been that the Russians have made up their minds that they're going to go to the Polish border, that's the only viable solution for them. And so all of this talk, insofar as China wants to maintain its position and not, kind of like float in between and try to see if something can happen, and that's good on them. And Haas and your advisor, his name's slipping in my mind, my Alzheimer's hitting. What's his name again?
Steve Kotkin.
Yeah, he might be floating this idea too. But from the point of view of the Russians, they cannot allow even a rump Ukraine to become a NATO vassalage, because it would just simply push the Polish-Ukrainian border right up to the Dnieper River. It would not solve the problem that the Russians see of Ukraine of joining NATO. And so I don't see that happening. And it's all good and fine for the Chinese to be wanting some sort of demilitarized zone, or in the West even. But from the Russian point of view, they need a docile, peaceful, very quiet Ukraine, whatsoever that shape may be. And that cannot have NATO troop, not even in 1 centimeter of that land. I'm sorry, Alexander, I cut you off.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a few things. First of all, I mean, this proposal, the proposal that's been taken here, Ukraine makes territorial concessions. It gets security guarantees. What's left of Ukraine gets security guarantees. It stays out of NATO, but joins the EU. That, in essence, was the plan that was made in March last year. We almost got to that point. The Russians at that time were willing to go along with it. It failed because the Biden administration and the British government basically shot it to pieces. My own view is that it's good to see that some people in the West are coming round to that view now, but it's too late. The caravan has moved on. And if we're going to get a peace, then it's going to have to go well beyond what was almost successfully negotiated last March. Now, there is one extremely important sentence in that Chinese readout of the conversation between Xi Jinping and Zelensky, because in it,
by the way, oops, something happened to Tarik. As soon as he's back, I'll bring him back on. Something happened with his thing. I wanted to ask you, I have been away, and so I did not hear about the conversation between, let me bring him back on. Hang on. There we go, Tarik.
Computer problem.
No problem. And we didn't advance in our conversation. The question I want to ask you, Alexander, is that I have been a little bit incommunicado, so I did not catch that. There finally was a conversation between Zelensky.
Oh yes,
and
there
Xi.
was. There was a right yesterday. There was a telephone
Mm.
call. It was a telephone. It wasn't a virtual meeting. It wasn't a summit meeting. There was a
Mhm.
telephone call. And there's a very, very interesting readout between what Xi Jinping said to Zelensky and what went on backwards and forwards. And this is a Chinese readout. And for me, the crucial sentence was one in which Xi Jinping talks about Europe, peace and stability in Europe. And if you track Chinese statements, what they have been hinting at is that there have to be major changes to the overall European security architecture. Because without those changes, the Russians themselves will never feel secure. And the problems that we see will begin to recur. Now, the Russians, of course, have been seeking changes to the security architecture of Europe since the end of the Cold War. And back in, I think it was 2010, Medvedev actually made some very, very serious proposals which were never considered. The West simply ignored them. And the Russians, in December 2021, they proposed 2 draft treaties for, again, a restructuring of the security architecture in Europe. And of course, the Western powers refused to talk about them. I mean, they just would not negotiate on the substance of those treaties at all. The Chinese, ever since those 2 draft treaties were proposed, have basically said, we agree with the Russians on this. It seems to me from the Chinese readout that Xi Jinping, in that very ambiguous way that Tarik was talking about, because he's absolutely right. They're very careful not to be precise or to be pinned down on any specifics. But they're basically saying, by bringing up the topic of Europe, that they still think that that's the only real way out of this. There has to be a restructuring of the security relationship in Europe. Now, I'm going to say this straight away. I cannot imagine that the United States will agree to that. I believe that rather than agree to that, especially if it is now being proposed by Beijing, or we get into a situation where it looks like it's being proposed by Beijing, I think that rather than agree to that, rather than have a settlement of this conflict on that kind of basis, the Americans, at least the current administration, would rather Ukraine went down to outright defeat. That would be from their point of view less difficult and less challenging than a situation where the entire security architecture, the position of the United States, the status of NATO, all of that were opened up for discussion. Now, I cannot imagine that these very sophisticated people in Beijing don't understand that. But, they are making those points, and I think they're absolutely right to make them. Because, to be frank, without some kind of shift on the security issues, the general security issues in Europe, I personally cannot see a long-term solution to this problem for exactly the reasons that Gonzalo said.
Yeah, my thinking is that the Chinese are playing this game also, not because they care about the United States or Europe or Ukraine or even Russia. I think that they're making these moves insofar as trying to be the honest broker, strictly to play to their peanut gallery, which are the other Asian countries, the other unaligned countries, the countries where China is building the Belt and Road Initiative. I think that that's the Chinese actual audience. And I think that the Chinese, to your point, Alexander, they're under no illusions. And I do believe that the Americans have made up their minds that they're going to support Ukraine to the last Ukrainian soldier. And then they're going to try to pump weapons into whatever remains of Ukraine to create some sort of partisan activity make Ukraine, or what remains of Ukraine, be like Afghanistan to the Americans, or Iraq to the Americans. Just this partisan warfare, or some sort of guerrilla movement. I think that's what they're thinking, and so they have no interest or motivation to do any kind
well,
of.
I'll speak to that, but I want to hear what Tarik has to say. Tarik,
my problem with all of these scenarios is that they're literally scenarios, right? And I don't think this is a trivial point here.
No.
For one thing, I totally agree with Alex on the fact that what the Chinese are saying, not only implying but saying, when you read their statements, is very clearly that they want to insist on ideas such as that the security of one state should not come at the security of another. That is very clearly a dig at Ukraine and other Eastern NATO members, actually, as well. They also are very clear that they don't like that the security of a whole alliance comes at the expense of the security of another state. This is all explicit in their plan, or in their readout, or in both, right? So they also speak exactly as Alex has pointed out. They reopen this whole issue of that Europe needs a different security architecture as a whole, right? And the stakes are, as you both point out, then extremely high. Now, as a historian, I would like to point out one thing. It is striking to see Beijing telling the Europeans that they need a new security architecture with a degree of plausibility, right? How the tables have turned, and rightly so. I mean, history is healing to an extent here. But let's leave that aside, right? About your scenario, Gonzalo, I think it's one possible outcome and one of the very worst. But I do think you might want to also consider that Russia is bearing heavy costs as well, right? You need to make a distinction. There were delusional assumptions in the West how costly this would be for Russia, right? There was the assumption that you just kick them out of SWIFT and they collapse, right? We will burn the ruble. The assumption that if Putin ever tries mobilization, his regime must fall. All of this has proven wrong. We know this. Russia has been much more resilient than a lot of people in the West predicted. This is all clear. There's no doubt about this. But the fact that Russia has been more resilient than our neo-Cold Warriors and neocons in the West were fantasizing about doesn't mean it doesn't have costs. This is costly for Russia as well. And I personally have to tell you, I don't think that it would make sense for Russia to try to conquer all of Ukraine. I think this would be a terrible strategy for them, and I hope they know that, because they would end up in a direct confrontation with NATO right across the border. They would end up exactly with the counterinsurgency war that you have been referring to. And even before the escalation in February, we already had reports of the CIA training people in Ukraine precisely for an insurgency. Right? Why would the Russians not think about this? I don't think they're that inflexible. Now, what you are saying, that they also won't go back to March 22, there I totally agree with you, right? So ultimately, you could see all sorts of new combinations emerging, but one combination, and I think we should take that seriously, is March 22 plus, right? Where, for instance, you offer Ukraine all sorts of things in return for making some concessions on territory. But you also are very clear about the fact that NATO can no longer do sneak NATO membership as it was doing with Ukraine, right? So we're not just talking about not having membership. We would have to talk about verifiable criteria that make it, and those are possible, that's technically possible, to make it clear that Ukraine has a substantial army, but that it's a defensive force, and that it's no longer being systematically integrated with NATO and all of the sort of stuff that they were doing intensely since 2014. Now, again, you can always argue that so much trust has been lost that nobody wants to try to do this anymore. But frankly, how do wars end then? You know, sometimes you have to, in my view, you have to compare the lost trust with the expectation of cost, right? And if your expectations of cost are high enough, you may want to overcome your loss of trust, right?
I don't know in this case. I see your point.
If I could just say, Tarik, a lot. If you actually go into the weeds of the March 22 proposals, there were actually some of those precise provisions already there. So, for example, Ukraine would not be able to host, even for military exercises, even small numbers of troops from other countries, except with the agreement of all the guarantors. And one of the guarantors, of course, remember, was Russia. So there could be no NATO troops, in effect, in Ukraine without Russian agreement. That was actually there in the draft documents that were almost signed off in March 22. The basic problem from a Russian point of view is this. What if we agree to this? What if we come to an agreement along these lines? How can we be sure that the other side will abide with it? And this is the real problem now that we have over this conflict. We've had 8 years of the Minsk agreement, which wasn't honored. We had the collapse of the negotiations in March. I don't think that the Russians want to occupy the whole of Ukraine. I think that there are arguments in Moscow all the time about how far they should go. But I think that this has been much talked about and thought about in Moscow. I don't think at this moment in time, the Russians themselves have a clear idea of where they're going to stop. But if they're going to seek a compromise of the kind that you're talking about, this is where we get into the issue of not just security guarantees for Ukraine, but security guarantees for Russia too. And that's where great changes to the security structure in Europe come. Now, you made a very, very important point previously, which is, of course, that what China also wants to see, and if I agree, by the way, the idea of China involving itself in European affairs is astonishing. This is something that has never happened before in European history. I mean, you have to go back to the time when the Persians were making decisions for the Greeks in the 4th century BC to have a situation where a non-European power is involved in European affairs in this kind of way. So this is a colossal event, maybe one of the biggest events of this year up to this point. But what the Chinese, I think, also want to see is the Europeans starting to distance themselves from the United States. Now, I have to say, I agree very much with the way in which Gonzalo characterized some aspects, the policies of some people in Washington. I think they would prefer to see the whole thing go up in flames, this utterly nihilistic policy, foment war, foment chaos in Ukraine, keep the Russians bogged down, turn Ukraine into some kind of Afghanistan for the Russians. I don't know how practical that is, but it's a terrible plan. It's an awful plan. And the question we in Europe need to ask ourselves is, if that is the plan that the dominant faction in Washington wants us to follow, do we in Europe, given that this is our neighborhood, want to have anything to do with it? Because frankly, I think for Europe, that is a nightmare. And I think the Chinese, who, as I said, are very sophisticated people, understand that. And it's very interesting that in that conversation between Zelensky, Xi Jinping said that he's going to send a high representative to talk not just to Ukraine, but to all the parties. That obviously means the Russians. Perhaps it means the Americans. I'm not sure about that. But I have no doubt at all it will mean the Europeans as well. And I think the Chinese will be pointing out. And by the way, I say the Chinese, I am sure that every step the Chinese have been taking, they will have talked about it with the Russians in advance. I'm not saying that the Russians have green lighted it, but the Russians will know what the Chinese are doing. But I that we might start to see the Chinese coming along, saying, as Xi Jinping apparently said to Macron and almost persuaded Macron, in your own interests now, you need to have some degree of strategic autonomy from Washington. Because if not, you're going to have this open fire on your borders. It might burn the Russians, but it will also burn you.
Let me say one thing, last thing, because I think we've sort of exhausted it about this issue of where could a compromise be, right? I got us into the weeds of this, so it's my own fault. And I think the much wiser position is precisely the Chinese position, not to anticipate too much. Yeah. But I would point out one thing. You are right, of course, that a lot of these ideas were around last March. But what would be different is that by this time, if it ever came to this after, now, Russia would take more territory. So that's not the same thing. And they would be able to have claim to have won the war. So that's not quite the same thing. So there are different things on the table here. But let's I would say let's bracket that off, because I want to agree with both of you on two big issues. One is Gonzalo's point that there are people in Washington who are utterly destructive, right? And they have used Ukraine, they have bled Ukraine dry already to bleed the Russians. This is what has happened here, right? They've used Ukraine as a pawn in a proxy war. That it's a terrible crime against Ukraine that they have committed, and that the Europeans have helped the Americans commit. And all of that with this insanely hypocritical rhetoric of helping Ukraine, of being friends with Ukraine. It's disgusting. And so Gonzalo's point is that there are people who would probably be okay with having Ukraine destroyed even more and turning it into a long-term battlefield for an insurgency to bog down the Russians. That there are such people in Washington, I absolutely believe it. And that they could call the shots in the end, as far as America will be able to call the shots. I believe that as well, unfortunately. So total agreement there. But one thing about something you said, Alex, which is this problem, the Macron-Xi Jinping problem of Europe having to emancipate itself really from the United States. Well, I couldn't agree more. Of course, Europe must emancipate itself from the United States. This is a totally toxic relationship by now. It is. And there is a fundamental lie, and we've talked about this once before on this show, I think, in the Atlanticist position. Because what Atlanticists in Europe are trying to sell you is that we Europeans, we EU Europeans, must maintain strong cooperation with the United States. And only this way we can preserve peace, security, blah, blah, blah. But the reality isn't cooperation. The reality is vassalage, right? Nord Stream there are many other ways you can prove this, but if people don't get it after Nord Stream, they're idiots. The reality is precisely not cooperation. We are not cooperating with the United States. We are submissive to the United States in a very bad way. And what we are doing by this, I'm not just saying this out of reasons of, herd nationalism or something. No, there is something very bad that Europe is doing here to global security, which is we are emboldening the United States. Europe is a huge factor of economic power, at least. It has a certain military power and a certain military potential. If Europe turned to the United States and said, for instance, if you go to war with the Chinese, count us out. That way, Europe could actually help global security and peace, because that's the only way, if there's any way left, that these neocon madmen in Washington will still listen. If we would literally tell them, you are on your own. We know you're megalomaniacs, so probably it won't help to tell you this, but at least don't count on us. That's the very minimum Europe could do to break this horrible tendency in the United States. And that precisely takes emancipating Europe from the United States. And if Europe, last thought here, and it's very general, but if Europe finally used its demographic, technological, economic potential to become security autonomous, which it could be, of course. Of course, it has all the preconditions for that. If Europe did this, it could still cooperate with the United States. I would even say it should cooperate with the United States, but the point would be that that would finally be a basis for real cooperation instead of being a client. And at the same time, Europe could also then productively cooperate, say with Russia, or some sort of Eurasian Union, if Russia pulls that together and makes it, it's already there, but makes it count, or with China and whoever China will work with. Europe could cooperate with these different entities in a productive manner, furthering global security by becoming autonomous first. And the obstacle to autonomy for Europe is the United States. It's not Russia. Europe has other issues with Russia. It may have other issues with China. But the obstacle to Europe's autonomy is precisely the United States and nobody else. And we need to get that out of the system.
I agree that the obstacle to European autonomy is the United States, but I think that you're missing the relevant agent who's making the situation so, which is the European leadership. The European leadership in its totality across the board.
I'm not missing this. I'm talking about what we need to do. I realize how incredibly hard this would be, and that own leadership.
I don't think it's possible because of
they're
the European
basically
leadership.
Compradors.
Well,
I understand.
That's
That's what's happened.
And so I don't see the democratic process of Western Europe removing this cosmopolitan leadership class that is beholden to Washington. Because, I mean, you get rid of Scholz and you get Baerbock. You get rid of Baerbock and you get the next, beholden, and so that's the thing.
But
well, can I just say something? Because what Tarik is talking about, in effect, is Europe achieving, getting for itself something very close to what it did achieve in the second half of the Cold War, when in fact we had the process of détente. And it's important to say that détente, to a great extent, started in Europe. It's actually started principally in Germany. You had German leaders, you had people like Brandt and Schmidt. Of course, there was de Gaulle, who was also always keen on some kind of rapprochement with the Russians. But the point about Europe in the 60s and 70s and 80s, to a great extent, was that it was a moderating factor. So we already had some very wild people at that time in Washington. I'm sorry to say, America tends to have a habit of producing some very strange people from time to time, some very dangerous people. But, the British said, we're not getting involved in Vietnam. We're not involved in that, for example. Harold Wilson, who was the British Prime Minister in the 1960s, said, this isn't something we're prepared to do. Brandt in the 60s also said, we're going to pursue Ostpolitik. He didn't do that because the Americans told him. He did that because German interest told him to. And that did create a relaxation of tensions. That did create a change in the international system. I lived through it. My early years were years which experienced détente. I remember that time in the 70s. And it was, believe me, a much safer, we felt a lot safer and a lot better in many respects than you do now. But détente did not come out of nowhere, because if you go back to the decade before the 60s, in the 1950s, you found extreme tension in Europe too. And of course, the policies of people like Adenauer at that time were very, very confrontational with the Russians. There were crises in Europe. There was a major crisis in 1961 over Berlin, for example, which was far more dangerous than people perhaps today understand. So you had to get through a very difficult period of crisis before the European political class of that period began to change direction. Now, I don't say it's going to happen again, but I will say this. It has happened once before, that you went through a period of extreme tension to one of political relaxation. And it was led by people in Europe, and if you'd been in Europe in, say, 1955, you might not have expected it to come.
To your point, Alexander, you and I did a discussion about the Western leadership class a couple of months ago, and the current the European leadership class of the 50s and the 60s and even into the 70s had the conception of the well-being of their own people, and they had the conception that they were European and were not aligned with the Americans. But the current leadership establishment is completely aligned with the Americans.
Yes.
And so I don't see any way that the Europeans will cleave from the Americans, and I think that they're going to follow them off the deep end. There's also something else too. I do recall that détente and Nixon going to China. I mean, détente, you're absolutely correct. It started in Europe, but it really accelerated when Nixon it started the rapprochement with China, because they realized that because the United States had overextended itself in Vietnam, it had to retrench. And so the notion was, we will cleave China from Russia and basically do triangulation, in Dick Morris's famous phrase. But what has happened now is that the American leadership and the European leadership, they don't care about their own people anymore. I mean, that's the key notion, because, détente, the American retrenchment in the early 70s and throughout the 70s, that was a product of the leaders actually being concerned about the well-being of their own nation and realizing that their nations were deteriorating because of this excessive confrontation. But the current leadership views power as its own sake and doesn't really care about their own people. They certainly demonstrated. And the German leadership class, the entire German leadership class, has been completely silent on the Nord Stream bombing, which was a direct affront. I mean, it was an act of war against Germany. And yet the German leadership class was very la-di-da about it. So
it's worse.
I'm going to just very quickly answer. I'm going to very quickly answer to that, and then I'll pass on to Tarik. But briefly, I am entirely of the same view about the current European political class. I don't think they have any conception or understanding at the moment, in their generality, of trying to break away from the United States, and that is a major problem. But there is always the issue of national interest, and national interest can sometimes break through. So if things continue to get difficult and very tense in Europe, then there is always a potential for change. And I think the only thing I can do in this issue is point out that Europe does have options. It doesn't need to follow this tunnel, go down this particular tunnel.
I agree. But they're going down it.
Well, wait, but I mean, it can choose to do things differently. And merely pointing out the fact that that choice is there, and, I don't want to imply, that I have a tremendous reach, but I think if all of us do that, then simply pointing out the fact that there are alternatives makes it more plausible that eventually those alternatives might be adopted. The alternative, after all, to doing that is despair. And I refuse to give up. I mean, I don't like to. I always say counsels of despair are always bad counsels. Tarik, I pass on to you.
Look, Gonzalo, I'm a horrific pessimist myself. You cannot imagine the instinctive sympathy I have with you on this. And like Alex, I totally agree with you. You look at people like Borrell, Baerbock, Biden, Ursula von der Leyen. I mean, this is a lost generation of leaders. I agree. Now, but I also agree with Alex, right? And this is a little bit because of my, how should I say? It is because I'm socialized as a historian, and I've been a historian for a very long time. And the one lesson I've taken away from history by now, and it's really only one, is the limits of our imagination are not the limits of the possible. Right? It happens again and again. You look back into the past and you think, what are people thinking in 1900 is going to happen in the next 20 years? Not what's going to happen, right? So there, I agree with Alex that we can't know. But at the same time, I very much agree with you, Gonzalo. The people who are leading Europe now, no way. But look, I wanted to talk about something else. One second point, and then I pass back to you, Gonzalo, which is I was very intrigued and interested by your mention of détente, and I think you're right. There was a European moment inside détente, right? But here's my pessimist's angle on that, which is détente ended. And why did it end? Because the Americans and really the Soviets made it end, right? So at the end of détente, you get to this place in the early 80s where the weight that Europe has, if you want, like Helsinki is the great peak, right? 1975. The history shows you it wasn't enough. It could be ended again. And then you go through another horrible cycle in 83, where we nearly blew ourselves up again, right? Globally. And then you come out of that because basically Gorbachev, right? So here's why I'm saying this, not because I want to nitpick. I'm saying this because I think Europe needs to go much further than this now. This time, Europe has to actually really change fundamentally. And I think we agree on this, the relationship to the United States, right? Being sort of with the United States and pulling it from inside the camp is no longer enough, right? I think that Europe really has to get out of this camp with the United States. And there, from that position, it may be in a place where it can actually influence them for the better again. Maybe. If at all, right? I think we need to go much, much further now. We need to adopt a really strictly goalist vision, right? I mean, there's a reason why the West European Defense Initiative is scuppered by the Americans. There is a reason why the Élysée Treaty in the 60s isn't allowed to happen by the Americans and by part of the German social Christian Democrats who knife Adenauer in the back to prevent this, right? Because Adenauer has gone to goalist at this point for their taste. So as long as we stick in this toxic relationship for which there's no good reason anymore at all, less than in the Cold War, it's not going to work. We need to get out now. I think that's the point, right?
I completely agree, and I think this is entirely correct. And of course, it's always important to say. This is now what I'm going to say is a historical cliche, so maybe one shouldn't place too much on it. But the times produce the people. I mean, the fact that Europe needs to find that strategic autonomy can result in the people who need to obtain it, who need to achieve it. It might produce them. There's a fundamental point to understand. In the Cold War, there was one thing that bound Europe, Western Europe, and the United States very close together, and that was the ideological challenge from the other side. The Soviet Union and its allies, but the Soviet Union was had a political and economic system which was unacceptable to the Europeans. It's a hugely powerful country, so you had to have the United States on side to keep the Soviets away, and that basically bound everybody together with each other. That doesn't apply anymore. That isn't the situation that we live in today. So that really important piece of glue has gone. What is holding us together in this combinat, if you like, is the legacy of the past. That's what we used to do, so that's what we know, and that's what we continue to do. And certain, shall we say, shared values, which are not quite the same as, the reason I use the word values is precisely because that's what the Americans constantly preach about. This talk about values, which is, it's very thin when you really think about it.
No, I mean, I think that basically our disagreement between you two gentlemen and myself, you believe that Europe can break away from the American embrace and go in a third direction, if you will. at least geopolitically, and tamp down the issue of Ukraine to solve it one way or the other. But I believe that the Europeans are just simply too beholden to the Americans, and that there will never be enough European political will to break away from that death grip that the Americans have on them. And I think that, please correct me if I'm misinterpreting your position.
I'm going to say one thing, which is that both of our arguments are at very real risk of being tested to destruction.
Yeah.
If the crisis in Ukraine, and if it gets worse and worse and worse all the time, as it looks, every likely possibility that it may do, if we really get into a situation where the Americans are trying to foment some kind of massive war in Ukraine, partisan wars and all that kind of thing, if that doesn't make Europeans change their minds about the situation in Europe, then really, I think at that point, you can start to give way to despair. I have to say that in my experience, countries, nations, people have to find a way through. And they always do in the end. When things look very bad, that
the level of destruction.
I know. That concentrates minds and makes people make decisions and break away from ideas that they might not otherwise have done. But,
by the way,
it's a terribly bleak thing.
Yeah, a quick little, parentheses of local color here in Ukraine. In Western Ukraine, there is an enormous amount of propaganda at every single level of society, insofar as pushing the notion of Ukraine and Poland as brother people, and that basically Poland will be a savior of Ukraine. It's something that I'd heard about a couple of times here and there, but I've reached out to different people, and that is a very concerted effort to inculcate that idea in Western Ukraine. And I don't have any strong contacts in Poland. I mean, I know Polish people, but not currently in that area. But I would not be surprised if something similar is happening on Eastern Poland. And the notion that they're setting up Poland as the next proxy in this conflict against Russia, I think that's something that, I wish we could discount it and think of it as like, oh, that'll never happen. But it seems that they're aggressively laying the groundwork, not just in terms of military preparedness, but also in terms of propaganda and manipulating public perceptions in the area in question. So I think that's a real possibility that will extend this conflict, because I think that we're all in agreement that the Kiev regime's armed forces are coming to the end of their tether, and this vaunted offensive, whensoever it happens, is really going to be a last throw of the dice. I mean, are we in agreement with that, or do you think that there is a chance?
Well, even the American media is saying that. Even the BBC today is saying it. So I mean, if they're saying it, why shouldn't we think it?
Yeah.
Look, I agree with both of you that the signs accumulating are that this is what's happening, right? That if it even happens, which is now questionable, it may very well, but it also may not happen, or may not happen still for quite a while, right? This has all been called into question by now officially. But that this offensive, this great counteroffensive, is some sort of desperate gamble. And it is clear that we are getting signs from the Americans preparing us for it to produce underwhelming results, right?
Yeah.
And that, I don't want to be cynical about this. Let's not forget, a lot of people will die, including a lot of Ukrainians, to produce those underwhelming results that are already being predicted in that scenario.
Yeah.
Now, I say what I always say. I'm not a military expert, but I've read enough about wars in the past to know that you can never entirely predict them. So I agree with you in the tendency, but I'd also withhold judgment until things unfold, right? But if you come back to this bigger issue, how could, again, it intrigues me, how could Europeans learn to take a step back from this extremely close pathological dependency of the United States that has now developed, right? Look, it could also perhaps happen gradually if the Ukraine war ends in a defeat of the West. And I mean a relative defeat, a defeat that is not so horrific that the world goes down in flames, which is a possibility, unfortunately, but a defeat that is bad enough to demonstrate to the Europeans and even the Americans who still have eyes to see that something went really wrong, right? The bad feeling you got after leaving Kabul airport the way you did, right? When you had to acknowledge, even America for a moment, it took them like a week or so, right, to get over that, had to acknowledge this wasn't our finest hour and we cannot talk it up anymore, right?
Yeah.
So if something goes wrong there, and if people like, say, the Greens in Germany should lose power finally, which I really hope, right? Maybe there would be a gradual scenario for certain forces in Europe to come back and say, look, for instance, let's repair Nord Stream. Let's go after the Americans with political means and judicial means for destroying it. Let's be clear about the fact that we are not ready, not only to fight, we are not ready to fight with the Americans against China, we are also not ready to join their technology war against China and the economic war. And this has been acknowledged. I mean, the Economist calls it a technology war openly, right?
Yeah.
And Adam Tooze has pointed it out as well, very, very correctly. What is happening now is an economic declaration of war by the United States on China, right? This has happened in the last half of the last year. And the Europeans, up until now, it's not as if there must be people in German industry, for instance, and in French industry, and in Italian industry, and so on, who don't want this, right? But what we are seeing is that, to use a Gramscian term, the hegemony is entirely with the other guys. That's true. But could the hegemony maybe shift one day? Could it open up again so that voices can again be heard who don't want to be submissive with Russia, who are not Putin friends and all that stuff, but who are ready to engage in normal relationships of mutual benefit with Russia and with China, despite the tensions and despite the many obstacles that now have to be overcome? Concretely, could there be voices that finally call into question the sanctions regimes, which are not working anyhow, right?
Well, the short answer to that, Tarik, and this is my own view, is that this is what you've just described, is what in Britain, and the thing to understand about Britain at the moment is we've got ourselves into a position of being more royalist than the king. We are more fervently Atlanticist and hostile to Russia than even the Americans themselves are, because for all kinds of complicated reasons, which I'm not even sure I myself understand fully.
Yeah.
But if you follow the British media carefully, particularly those news organs, which one senses new media organs, which are perhaps closest to the thinking of the Conservative government, like the Daily Telegraph, for example, which is almost, you've lived in Britain, I think, Tarik, almost the house organ of the Conservative Party. They are terrified. They are terrified of precisely the thing you said, that people in Europe are going to start adding together what's happening and coming to the kind of conclusions that you said. They are very worried that there are people in Europe who are thinking this isn't going well. This isn't a solution we want to see. This isn't what our future ought to be like. That there are people in German industry, as you said, and French industry and Italian industry, that there are probably people in the German and French and Italian defense establishments, particularly, by the way, the German defense establishment. People like that who are saying this really isn't working. And that if it all goes wrong in Ukraine, those voices which have been intimidated into virtual silence up to now will finally find the courage to come and speak out. And that's, of course, I think, as I said, in London, there is that fear. And of course, what it is doing is, I think, because that fear exists, it's making the British even more shrill and even more belligerent and even more demanding all the time that we must escalate, we must keep up the war, we must impose more sanctions, we must send more weapons, because you need somehow to keep the people on side. Can I just quickly, before going back to the both of you, talk about what Gonzalo says? I know quite a lot of people in Poland, without a single exception, and I don't pretend I have a representative, no representative pool of people in Poland. They are very well aware of these plans. They are absolutely horrified by them. I think that if Poland were to find itself drawn into Ukraine, despite what some of the opinion polls might suggest to you, there would be a great many people in Poland who would not be happy about that at all. There would, over time, I'm sure, be a backlash against it. There are elections coming in November, which are looking precarious for the governing party. And not just for Poland, but for Europe. Dragging Poland into this, it seems to me, is a catastrophic idea. It's the fastest way of transmitting this crisis deeper into the center of Europe itself. And again, one can only wonder at the kind of people who come up with these plans, both in Kiev, obviously, well, they have a reason, I suppose, but in Warsaw, and of course in London and Washington, where of course there are advocates for this sort of thing.
Yeah, and so to your point, Alexander, I mean, these people are crazy, and more to the point, of course, they have so poisoned the well of European political discourse that it seems to me that for the foreseeable future, I mean, talking the next 5 years, I do not see it possible politically for any European politician to stand up and say, hey, this Ukraine thing has gone far enough. Let's talk to the Russians and figure out a way to end this and wind it down. I think that it would be political suicide for any European politician, precisely because the well has been so poisoned insofar as basic diplomacy. We started this conversation with Lavrov at the UN Security Council. And the Americans and their toadies walking out, in a big huff. And in Europe, did they comment on this? Have they said anything? No, they're on board with this idiocy. I mean, look, when I mentioned the issue of dragging Poland into this, I think it's a horrifying idea. It's absolutely disgusting. But that seems to be the direction that they're all going. And I'm like,
I cannot, in fact, I am absolutely sure that there are British diplomats, and I'm talking about British diplomats, who saw that charade, that nightmare at the Security Council, and must be quietly seething that they have that they have been part of that thing. So, and I know also that in London, even throughout the political class, there is extreme dismay about the fact that instead of the Russians being isolated around the world, it is we ourselves who are being. Now, I don't expect things to change with the political class today or tomorrow. I'm talking about the day after tomorrow, provided we get there. And it won't be this political class. It will be whatever comes after it. But I come back to what I said before. The time, the need can produce the people. I mean, it's happened before.
Yeah, but it takes
Yeah, but
I don't know.
Look, let's zoom out, right, for a moment, because we have our positions here. But if you widen the frame a little bit, right? I see two factors that in the future, not the very far away future, I mean a future that's still relevant, right, might exert influence on many Europeans that might actually be beneficial. And then I'll tell you what these two factors are. One is, as insane and really, I'm sorry to put it bluntly, stupid as people like Baerbock are, not everybody is Baerbock, right? Not everybody is an ideologized idiot. I'm sorry, I have to be blunt here. So there are people in Europe who can see two things, I think. One is that what's happening with the United States is very interesting, namely that it's not just Nord Stream. In general, they're becoming much more ruthless and demanding again with their so-called allies. They're dropping their last inhibitions there, right? Look, and give you an example, right? When they started their technology war, CHIPS Act, IRA, then the October things that the presidential blah, 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 on China, they immediately put pressure on the Netherlands, hitting it economically, right? Not to export complex chip making machines, and the Dutch complied. Now they're putting the same sort of pressure on South Korea over DRAM chips, right? Over Samsung and another manufacturer in a complicated play that has to do with the Americans wanting to basically preempt the Chinese going after Micron in revenge, retaliation for the tech war that the Americans started. So there are other examples. But what I'm trying to say is the Americans are also becoming extremely ham-fisted in the way they're managing their allies. Nice. And that creates pain, and I think it will accumulate. The other thing that I see is, look, even anybody but Baerbock must understand that there is a world emerging, call it multipolar or whatever term you can live with, that has the BRICS and the BRICS plus in it, right? Anybody there must understand that it means something, that the BRICS are working basically on reinventing the Bancor, right? On going back to the origins of the Bretton Woods system right now and toppling it, going against Harry Dexter White. Finally, Keynes' revenge, right? Now, this may not take off immediately, but at the same time, you have, and this is again the same tendency in America, they're burning their own means of influence by overusing them. They've become so ruthless that they're destroying their own levers. If you have the dollar and you are America, you should actually abstain from using it too much. You should not confiscate ever the reserves of another state. In the worst of situations, except you're directly yourself at war with them, you should never do this, because you're sending an incredibly strong signal that you cannot be relied on, right? For one thing. So what we are seeing now is that the Americans are using their dollar advantages in a very aggressive and brutal way. Secondary sanctions affect a lot of others, not just the Russians. We're seeing all these strong arm tactics coming into play. Now, again, I agree with you, Gonzalo. The current leaders of Europe, I don't know what it is. Are they all being blackmailed? Are the Americans having the compromat on these people? Do the Americans have the goods on Scholz and the Warburg Bank? I don't know what it is. Are they just insane, like Baerbock seems to be? Are they on their own personal insane power trip and taking revenge for the humiliations by Merkel, as von der Leyen seems to be? Are they, I don't know, have they read too much Kagan, like Borrell, the Gartenzwerg seems to be? I don't know what's wrong with these people, but there's nothing to be expected from them. But these pressures that I've just outlined, these two things, the Americans getting too brutal for their own good, with their allies, not with their opponents, and this emergence of these alternative poles of power. I mean, something's got to give with some people, no?
Well, I think to your point, Tarik, we really have to step back and understand that the United States as a global empire, a global hegemonic empire, is collapsing internally. I mean, there are all kinds of social divisions. There is the issue of unemployment. There is issue of a practically non-existent southern border with all of these immigrants wreaking havoc in the Southwest, for instance. I mean, there are so many problems in the United States. And I think that at some fundamental level, the American leadership knows that America's days are numbered. And so I believe that they're lashing out. And that's why they're brutalizing their own allies. Like you mentioned, the Dutch, the South Koreans. I mean, hell, they sent a few submarines to South Korea. What was that? That was basically a show of force. That was basically, you know, we can hurt you. You know, I mean, it's kind of like gangster approach to diplomacy with their own allies. And I think it's merely an expression of the sense the Washington establishment at some visceral level understands that their moment is quickly fading, and they're lashing out in desperation, thinking that, oh, if they do this, do that, we'll be back on top somehow. And I think that that's the driving force of this war with China that so many people in the United States are advocating. That they think that one big final war will put us back on top, just like after World War II, which is, of course, the world is radically different from 45. I'm sorry, Alexander, you were saying?
No, I was just simply going to say that nobody likes a bully, and anybody who has to deal with bullies. I mean, one of the things that's certain to be happening, maybe not at the very top level, but there must be an awful lot of people who are very resentful and very angry about this, about the fact that I'm sure you both know, but there's been a whole series of sanctions and threats just made against Cyprus, for example. And Cypriot lawyers and Cypriot banks have just been sanctioned by the Americans.
I haven't been aware of this. Why?
It has. It's because they're providing services to Russian oligarchs, supposedly. And this must be causing. I mean, this is causing, to my knowledge, a lot of resentment and a lot of anger in a small country like Cyprus, which, frankly, has been very loyal to the US and to the EU over these policies. So this is reproducing itself continuously. And if I can go back to what I was talking about previously about, the 50s and how the 50s it changed into the 60s and détente came, there's a very fundamental difference that's happened to the United States and to the US-Europe relationship, which is that in the 50s and the 60s, the United States wanted a prosperous, economically successful Europe. That was very much what the Americans needed and wanted. And they helped amazingly, to an extraordinary degree, Europe to achieve that very thing. If you look at European films, as I do, I'm a great film buff, by the way. If you see European films, particularly French films, for example, you see the world of Europe in 1950. And you then see it go 10 years forward and see what Europe looked like in 1960. The change is astonishing. And that was what the Americans were doing at that time. And during that very same period, the Americans were extremely skilled at alliance management. Now, we've just done a program on the Duran with a former American diplomat, an actual American diplomat when America did diplomacy, Chas Freeman. He worked with Nixon and Kissinger, he worked with George Shultz, and he talked about a lot of the style that America had in those days. And he said that very thing, that the Americans became very, very skilled at alliance management. They were prepared to talk with people, they were polite with them, they managed to work with them all of the time. Now, all of that's gone. So America is no longer your passport to prosperity. And it's no longer the country that treats you with respect. It's become the country that threatens and bullies you, that sanctions your banks, threatens your business people, makes it more difficult for you to prosper. And it must be causing a huge amount of resentment. Now, I accept that. The Borrells, the Ursulas, they're not going to change. But below the surface, and I come back to what I was saying, I'm sure, I know British diplomats, I know people who worked for the Foreign Office. They must be looking at those events in the Security Council, and they must be feeling extremely unhappy that Britain has been dragged along or dragged into this mess. They must be feeling incredibly embarrassed when they meet representatives of the global south from countries like India, for example, and they have to explain what's going on and why they're behaving in this bizarre and eccentric way, and why they're going around having to threaten countries like India, for example, and cause antagonism and anger in these places. So don't underestimate this. It's not going to have an immediate effect. And people, of course, are frightened. People are intimidated by what the United States can do. But eventually, the worm turns. And as I said, the national interests become overwhelming. So, coming back to the point that you were making before, Gonzalo, I don't think you can say never The question is how soon and with what cost incurred in the meantime.
If I may add a few thoughts. Look, Gonzalo, I agree with you on one big thing, which is that it strikes me as very strange that there are very smart people in the United States who are obsessed with geopolitics, and for a reason, it matters, but who completely neglect the fact that the home front is breaking away, that the society at home is being hollowed out, right, by their own policies. I don't think, personally, I have to say this, that migration is actually a problem. I think it's being talked up as a problem. I think if you compare, at least you can say the following, that the biggest problem for the United States is their so-called elite, which is a complete failure right now. That's the biggest problem. And then come the schools, and then come the high schools, and then comes the health sector, and then come infrastructure. You know, I think migration is very, very far away from the real issues. But
yes, I agree.
Gonzalo, let me stress, I agree with you on the fundamental point, which is that this is an empire that is sick at the core, right? Very sick at the core. And as a historian of the Soviet Union, I have to say, I can't help it again and again. They somehow remind me of the Soviets in the 80s. You know, they still have this enormous power projection. Soviets were never quite as big, right? But bigger than Russia is now. But inside, it's hollow and rotten. And there's a lot of rotting in the United States. But the other thing I was going to say is, you know, we talked about values as something that still keeps together like this West, right? But how long is that going to work? Because, okay, you can talk about values. But one thing, first of all, we can talk about democracy. The United States is not a democracy. It's an oligarchy with certain remains of democratic elements. I think that's a realistic description. I'm not being hyperbolic here. That's what they are. So how good is that going to work out for you? You have Macron and the way he's treated his own population recently. Pension reform is the last thing. Now, you can argue in favor of the pension reform. That's one thing, for economic efficiency reasons if you want. But the way he did it is also terrible. There's no doubt about it, right?
I'm agreeing with you completely. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, we have massive spying on each other, right? So our enemies spy on us, but the Americans obviously spy on us too. And there is the next scandal brewing right now, right? And the Germans once again try to help the Americans with the cover up, which is very funny. You can read it all in Spiegel, but it's there. The values thing is not going to last forever. We have Julian Assange, the single most important political prisoner in the world today. I'm not saying that others don't suffer as much as he does. Don't get me wrong. But if you think about the implications of his case, Assange is the single most important political prisoner today. He has been for years. He's being tortured systematically, and it's happening by two of the pillars of the West. You have endless scandals about not only the American political elite, that we take for granted. No, about the Supreme Court, one after the other. So that's the institution that's supposed to sort of keep a check on it, right? No checks left. So this whole value thing, it's going to give. And of course, the answer you always get when you mention these things is, what aboutism, right? As if it's all only relevant with respect to Russia. But you know what? Remove Russia from the planet, not literally. In imagination, the United States still has all these problems. It has nothing even to do with the comparison. They're just objectively there, right?
Yes.
The other thing I wanted to say, one more thing about what you said, Alex, is I agree with you that there was a time in American diplomacy after World War II, for 2 decades, maybe 3 decades, when American foreign policy was much more mature than it's now. Something has happened, right? But you know, there is another interesting aspect to this, which is you could almost say that what's happening to Europe right now is not so much that America has fundamentally changed its set of instruments, because these brutal instruments have always been there, right? They just were using them in Asia and Africa and in Latin America. What is happening to Europe is this degradation, as it were, in geopolitical terms, where they're suddenly they're beginning to treat the European partners the way they used to treat Latin America, and they still treat Latin America when they can, right? So it's very strange. What is so odd is that they behave like a state that doesn't need any good faith allies anymore, that only
Yes.
wants vassals who are afraid,
Yes.
right, and follow out of fear. And you see this precisely with the evidence of internal decline. It's paradoxical, but it also makes sense together, unfortunately, I think.
Yeah.
By the way, parenthetically, did you guys hear about, I forget, the name of the president of South Africa slips my mind at this moment.
Cyril
But
Ramaphosa.
Thank you so much. On Monday or whenever it was, he said, we're pulling out of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, because of course in August he's supposed to host Putin and the other leaders of the BRICS, I believe. And then 2 days later, we're back on, and I misspoke. You know what happened. The State Department made furious calls and basically bludgeoned him back in, because I do believe that they plan to somehow arrest Putin if he were to go to South Africa. If I were Putin, I would think it's insane to go. I would send a representative, I said Lavrov or whomever. But that trivial incident shows that the people at the State Department, I don't know if you gentlemen have ever heard of a game called Whack-A-Mole. It's a table game in amusement parks where like a little mole pops out and you have like a hammer and you're supposed to hit them. That's what they're playing, Whack-A-Mole. And they're bludgeoning their allies or people who could potentially be their friends. To your point, Tarik, and to your point, Alexander, it's very amusing.
Well, can I just talk to that? Because a couple of months ago, I did a program again after another speech by Lavrov, in which Lavrov talked about the kind of threats that the United States routinely now makes to various people, to diplomats from all kinds of countries, to try to shape UN's General Assembly votes. And Lavrov said that that students from these countries, which are the children of diplomats and who are studying in US universities, get threatened with expulsions, loss of visa rights, other kinds of things. There were some extraordinary things that he was saying. And I reported this. I said this on one of my videos, and I said, this is what Lavrov says. I don't know whether this is true, but this is what he said. And I got inundated. I got inundated from people from all over the world, but especially from Africa and Latin America. And it was a surprise to see the kind of people who actually follow the program. And they said, this happened to me. I have, this minor diplomatic position working for Costa Rica. And I got these instructions from the US. My government got these instructions from the US, and they spoke to us in this way. And I was one of the people who was on the receiving end of this. And I was astonished. I mean, I got so many of these emails, all of them private, so I can't disclose them. And the people who sent them to me, they don't want me to disclose them.
No, sure, of course.
But it really did show in the starkest way how threatening it was. And I remember one particular official from the foreign ministry of one of these countries actually said that on the eve of General Assembly sessions, the embassy, the US embassy, contacts that government, and this is an independent government, it's not an ally of the US, and tells them, like, these are the issues, these are the topics that are going to be discussed in the General Assembly, and this is how we expect you to vote when these things come up for discussion. And if with the implication that if you don't, well, the wrath of the United States will fall upon you. So this happens.
Sorry, this is funny.
And the emails and the emails are, well, I know quite. I mean, why is it so important to shape votes in the General Assembly? I'll leave that to another discussion another time. But both confirmation about the bullying and also confirmation I got personally about how deeply resented it is. So, it is there. Now, I didn't get anything like that from any European diplomat. I must say that. These were all from diplomats in the global south. But I've no doubt that similar things happen in Europe and are increasingly happening in Europe. They're happening all the time. But there it is.
A quick note to that, what you're saying. Now it would explain that scrum of people of the global South, practically, cheering Lavrov in the UN Security Council, because all of those countries must have been on the receiving end of this bullying. I'm sorry, I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, it's not only that, though. I think it's a much longer story, and people have pointed this out repeatedly because it's so obvious. If you're in the global South, if you're Indonesia, India, maybe even Singapore, although that's a different case, you have seen the world from a very different perspective, right?
Yeah.
For one thing, in many places in the global South, the Cold War wasn't cold, right? So this wonderful sort of John Lewis Gaddis idyllic story, like the long peace. There was no long peace, right? People got slaughtered in Asia and Africa during the Cold War, and partly even in Latin America, right? In various locations. So you've experienced the Cold War very differently, and you had a high probability of being slaughtered by Americans and their allies, right? Not just by the Soviets, who were also involved. So that's one thing. But the other thing is there's an even deeper history where these people have experienced again and again and again that the West is really, for the last 300 years, the biggest bully in town. Now, the same West turns to them and doesn't even appeal to international law. That would be one thing, but appeals to this bizarre notion of rules. Nobody knows what they are. Lavrov is totally right about this. It's obvious. They are black box, and they're designed so that we can say all the time what they are, and we make them fit what we want, right? That's what these rules are. And they can see through this. And we appeal to them on the basis of these rules and say, you must help us, say, sanction Russia, condemn Putin, go after Russian war criminals. And the problem is, it doesn't take being pro-Russian not to go along. It just takes knowing the West. Because if the West turns to you and says this to you, you don't need any sympathy for Russia. You need your own history, and your response will be, who are you? Why would we sacrifice anything to help you with this sort of issue? Because you're actually a worse bully than they are. And we know this from you. This is not whataboutism. They've experienced it, right?
Yes.
So, but that leads to another problem, which is we mentioned the BRICS, but there's an old issue that I think may come up again in the future, which is reforming the UN. And by this, I mean not just reforming the Security Council, which everybody talks about all the time, but the whole institution, right? Sooner or later, somebody is going to start talking about this again.
I completely.
And by the way,
Can
a quick parenthesis to my viewers, to my Patreon supporters. I just posted the link that you can come on and ask questions. Be brief, polite, and to the point to my guests, because I very much appreciate your input. So go to the Patreon channel to check there and find the link. I'm sorry, Alexander, you were saying?
No, what I wanted to go to the other point that you were both making about the internal decay within the United States, which is real. But one of the most extraordinary things, and I'm sure you both encountered this, because again, one of my most difficult things to do, I find it very difficult, is to go through all of these huge number of foreign policy magazines and articles that are written in the United States, and there are endless numbers of them. And one of the things that is very strange about them is that there is scarcely ever any acknowledgement of the limits of American power. They scarcely ever acknowledge that there are resource limits, that there is things that the US cannot materially do because its economy is already overextended, its military is overextended. And of course, it goes without saying that there are very, very few ethical constraints as well. But
yeah,
it's the absence of any acknowledgement that there's a limit to how far you can go, and it's very strange and very disturbing.
No, you and I, Alexander, have discussed this because the current leadership class has this false sense of security insofar as American power. They simply think it's limitless in all regards. They don't seem to understand that the United States has deindustrialized itself. It simply cannot churn out the, say, artillery that it would like to. And so what's fascinating is that their foreign policy establishment makes promises that their industrial base cannot fulfill. The weapons thing is most obvious now, but there are other issues too. The Western, the United States has hollowed itself out. And what has happened is that the leadership class as a whole, and including the people who write for these magazines, who most of them are, PhDs or people in think tanks, and they don't understand that they are in a bubble separate from the rest of the United States. They have become an elite, divorced from the people. Tarik, would you agree?
But can I just, before we proceed, just quickly to say that, and this goes back to Tarik's point about Europe. There is two sides to this, because of course Europe needs to find its strategic autonomy from the US, but the US perhaps is its power to control Europe is actually diminishing as well, which may partly explain why it is becoming so aggressive, because it has to be more threatening, more bullying for the reality that it doesn't have the force to get its own will in a gentler way that it once did.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think that's a very important point you've both raised. And look, there is a way in which, there's just been a fascinating article in The Economist about Chinese film consumption, right? And they have a little mythology, but what they're basically showing and admitting, right? If you're an economist, you're admitting this, it pains you, I think, is that the soft power of American movies in China is declining. That is very, very interesting. And there might be, and I'm sure there are more places where American soft power is under pressure. Now, the dollar is, as a power tool, is under pressure as well, right? So these instruments that the Americans can use, apart from the hammer, the sledgehammer of the enormous military, I agree with you, Alexander. I think they're diminishing. And so we might be entering into this very, very dangerous phase where, because in some way the United States is getting weaker, it's getting more dangerous, because it's more likely to reach for brute force all the time. But there's something else which I wanted to say about this decline problem, right? It does remind me of one thing, which is, as you probably know, around the time of the Second World War, there was an idea, and afterwards too, in the United States elite about the so-called garrison state. And it expressed a certain fear. And the fear was that if somebody comes to control basically Eurasia, their weight would be so great that they would force us to become a garrison state. We would have to become authoritarian. We would have to militarize ourselves, and so on and so on. We would have to change our American nature to compete geopolitically. And why am I mentioning this now? I mean, look at the latest defense budget proposals that are in now. They're once again absolutely record-breaking. And as I think Michael Clare has pointed out somewhere, much of this points to up to 2050. These are very long-ranging plans, again, projecting military power, precisely military power of enormous dimensions if they can afford it. But those plans may not work out. But I think it's something to be very afraid of, that this oligarchy with democratic remains could become much, much worse again in the process of trying to defend its empire at all costs.
Yeah, it is creating this Eurasian power by way of its insecurity and its garrisoning. It's not that the Eurasian power created the garrison, it's the reverse. Out of insecurity of the diminishing power, they create the garrison rather, which forces—
It's a scenario.
Yeah. Let me bring on Small Town Voice. Small Town Voice, she's a longtime supporter. Thanks very much for coming on. What's on your mind, Small Town?
Hi, thank you. I'm eating, so you don't see me. Regarding, I want to let you know that I on my channel, I had a live stream this morning. I tell you, regarding the ambassador, people in China are furious about this interview. They think the ambassador is not go far enough. they think the French guy, was humiliating China, because I don't know if you watched the whole thing to the end. He was humiliating Mao. Now, whatever the West are thinking about Mao, Mao is the founding father of the modern China. So he was saying something very disrespectful of Mao, which is totally irrelevant about their discussion. It serves no other purpose than just humiliating China. So people, at least my audience, thinking the ambassador was simply not far enough. So that's their complaint. And the other thing is that when the ambassador said something like there are certain states, the former Soviet states, that do not have legal, international legal ground, so their status is kind of like not that very settled. He actually is referring to the Baltic countries, that in this Belovezh Accord, which the Baltic countries was not part. Those other Soviet countries have been in that part, but not the Baltic countries. So he's not wrong. Again, this is factual. The Baltic countries didn't sign any legal documents to claim that they separated from the Soviet Union. So again, the ambassador is simply telling the truth. And yet he was mistreated and humiliating the founding father of the country. China, people in China online are absolutely furious about this. So I think I think if anything, the European leaders should be thankful that the Chinese government is much more constrained, because the people actually thinking the government should react stronger, in particular to this particular interviewer. So I just want to share that with you guys.
Thank you very much.
By the way,
extremely interesting.
Yeah, something I neglected to tell you, gentlemen, before bringing a small town voice on. Her social media and video media presence in China is substantial. I was on her show and I got like 100,000 views between her different products. Yeah.
I would love to you guys to come to my show one day. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.
So that's
just a question, Gonzalo, just a procedural question, as it were. Do you want us to sort of respond to that?
Sure. Whatever. Yeah. This is a free flowing conversation. You know, you can go wherever you want to.
I don't have anything very much to say except to thank the person. Yeah, carry on.
First of all, I would do exactly the same. I think this is an extremely interesting comment. I would also respectfully engage in some arguing.
You want me to bring her back on? I'm sorry. Small town voice, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. Yes.
So let me say again, I'm extremely thankful for your comment. I find it extremely interesting. For instance, I simply wasn't aware, because I didn't see the whole interview, that the French interlocutor brought up Mao, right? Now, let me see two things. I agree with you, and I think many of the people who have talked to you, if I understand you correctly, that bringing up Mao in this context, from what you tell me, doesn't seem to make sense, right? I personally, and I ask you to put this in brackets, I'm just being transparent with you. I personally, and I'm not an expert on China, have a very critical opinion of Mao. But that's me as a historian. And I agree with you that he didn't belong in this discussion, as you know, you explained to us. The one thing I would say, your point about the Belovezh Accords is very interesting. I now see what the ambassador was driving at. I would tell you and your listeners maybe, or your those who speak to you, that I still don't think that's really a decisive criterion, right? Because the Soviet Union, after the Belovezh Accords, very few people were actually there. The Belovezh Accords were really just made, which is a very problematic thing in itself, right? By the leaders of the Belarusian Republic, Ukrainian Republic, and Russian Republic. Basically, the three Slavonic core republics got together and decided for everybody. That's highly problematic anyhow. And then in Central Asia, there had to be another meeting and so on. So there's a general issue here. I personally would still maintain that it simply isn't a good idea or a diplomatic idea to cast doubt on the sovereignty of the Baltic states, right? I'm very critical of Baltic nationalism. I'm very aware that they haven't resolved their own minority problems well, that the Russians have some real complaints there. But I still think that Alexander was right, and I would join him here, that there the ambassador went too far. Now, I'm not saying you need to agree with me, but let me just state that.
Well, just so I think if you look at the whole picture, if you watch the whole interview, at least the part that I watched, the interviewer, that French guy was extremely aggressive. Okay. With that in mind, what ambassador was talking about, because the interviewer was saying, oh, there should be international laws, international this and that. The ambassador's point is simply that things are not that simple. It's complicated.
I got
and that's including, if you're talking about international law, there are certain countries, when they become independent, there is no law. There is no legal document to support anything. That's simply the ambassador's point. And
so,
when he was talking about it, he was thinking about those Baltic states when they broke out.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, so it's not like he's questioning anybody's sovereignty.
I see.
He's not questioning that at all. He's simply saying it's complicated. And you shouldn't
so that's a very important. That's a very interesting clarification, because I understand you to be saying what he was doing, he was trying to show the absurdity of his interlocutor's argument. That's what I understand you to be saying, and that really makes a difference, right? That isn't then saying I want to attack their sovereignty. That is much more like saying, if you apply these criteria only, then even those sovereignties would be in doubt. Okay, I get that. I get that.
That's a very important explanation, actually. Yeah.
If you watch the whole interview, you will see the ambassador actually trying very hard to keep himself, cool. In particular, in the end, it was very infuriating. The way the guy was talking about.
Can I just say that one of the most shocking things that's happened is the complete collapse of any standards of courtesy in the interviews that Western journalists now routinely conduct with countries with which the West finds itself has created problems for itself. I mean, interviews between China, European or American journalists and Russian officials have become a nightmare to watch. And it seems that this disastrous practice is now extending to China as well. And can I just say, anybody who has any experience of dealing with Chinese people, and I could say that I've been to China, would know what an incredibly foolish and unwise thing that is. I mean, given China's history, given the experiences that China went through during the 19th century, for French diplomat of all people. I mean, I've been to the front. I stayed quite a long time. The French concession in Shanghai. It's not called the French concession without a reason.
Yes.
Anyway, for a French journalist to start, taking that kind of approach with a Chinese diplomat, I can completely understand why Chinese people would be furious.
Alexander, I think you're sorry, Gonzalo, but let me just say one thing.
Sure.
I think you're absolutely right about the general point.
Yeah.
On one side, I'm very much in favor of journalists being hard-hitting, critical, but I do think what we are seeing is, once again, it's a sort of double standard, and we are seeing a lot of Western journalists becoming these, I'm sorry, but these information warriors who will treat an American or maybe an EU official with kid gloves and throw them softballs, and then will do their utmost to show like their aggression, because the audience has to see this somehow, right? Toward anybody else who is perceived as an opponent of the West. And I think that tendency is definitely there, and it's extremely disturbing and it's unprofessional. It's horrible.
No, it's Tarik. What's happening is that Western journalists, whenever they're speaking to somebody of the quote unquote opposing side, they'll sometimes start the interview saying, "Well, how often do you beat your wife?" That level of discourse.
Yeah, I know.
Which is just immediately poisons the well. And so, small town voice, you're basically saying that from the Chinese point of view, that was the perception of this interview with the French ambassador, and that's why he hasn't been pulled, and in fact, he's not going to get any kind of reprimand. Is that your
he won't.
point?
He won't. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. I agree with later the Chinese foreign minister came out, make clear things up. This is not our official position. There's no need to escalate even further. But I'm just telling you, the Chinese government is much, much more constrained compared with the public sentiment. Right now, I think the people, at least the online, was absolutely furious about this whole thing. They were like, okay,
And can I say one thing? Alexander said it before, but I would like to underline it. I totally agree with Alexander that there really is a way in which maybe this isn't a journalist's task, but it would be the task of European politicians. We should actually show a little bit of gratitude because, frankly, the Chinese initiative is very valuable in and of itself. And it is, I think, really the most reasonable thing that has happened, at least since March 22, when the initiative, interestingly enough, and I'm not saying this because of where I am, but when a peacemaking initiative was supported by Turkey, right? So since then, we haven't seen anybody coming in from the outside with the same degree of being constructive. Lula of Brazil has made contributions in that direction, but he's not in a position maybe to offer a plan, right? So I totally agree with Alexander that actually it's something where it would be useful if European politicians for once acknowledged that this is a damn good thing. They owe something there, actually.
Yeah. Small Town Voice, thanks so much. I really appreciate your contribution. It was outstanding.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah, so we've been going on a little over 2 hours, and I think we ought to be winding down the show. I don't want to try I don't want to try the patience of my guests. We've gone all over the place, and so is there any final thought or final notion that you'd like to leave the listeners with?
Yeah, I would say this. I think we are going through a very difficult period in international relations, and that's an understatement. And there's real danger that what Tarik was talking about, that the United States is going to become even more aggressive and even more dangerous and even more violent, is correct. But there have been difficult times in the past, and we have got through. And I still believe that we will get through this one as well. The question is, we got to keep a level head, and those of us who want to remind people that there are alternatives there, we mustn't be intimidated and prevented from saying that, because of course all three of us have come under various pressures at various times.
Yeah. Well, if you want the last word for me, right? A short
Wait,
one.
hang on. I hate to do this to you, but there's a longtime viewer that I really want to bring on, and because he's been very kind and he's a great interlocutor. David, how's it going? Thanks so much for joining us. Real briefly, because we're at the end of the show.
Yeah, gentlemen, hello. Great show.
Hello.
I just want to interject. It's like you're saying, I'm not sure we're living in unique times. It comes to the point where whether it's trading markets, sports, fighting warfare, it comes to the point where people are going to disagree. And when diplomacy fails, then what other choice do you have but to use whatever means is necessary? There's a saying that I love. You can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. And eventually, we're going to find out over time who's right and who's wrong. And
yeah,
said. Right, like Ukraine. If Ukraine is not going to acknowledge what the reality is or what we think the reality is, then they're going to lose everything.
Yep, yeah. I'm afraid you're right. Thanks, David. I really appreciate it. Take care. Okay, so yeah, thanks, David. I really appreciate that comment. That's absolutely right. I think that too many people are ignoring reality. And yeah, Tarik, I want to leave you with a final word. I'll give a final word before we go. So and please stick around.
Okay, I try to keep it very short. Look,
no, as you wish.
I'm really not. I hope I'm not naive, and I don't think that a world in which the United States is no longer striving for hegemony, having hegemony as it now does and has, will be wonderful. Not at all. Although I think we have to make the transition, right, for various reasons. Now, having said that, I actually believe, and some people will be struck by this, but I'm deadly serious, that the single most urgent task for global security now and for the near future at least will be to contain the United States. I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
And maybe even to deter the United States. Because I do think, once again, that they're going through very dangerous processes. And unlike the Soviets, right, who actually bowed out with a minimum of destructiveness, right, and they're still bitter about this, but it was better for the world, right? Gorbachev didn't know what he was doing, but it was better for the planet as a whole. Unlike the Soviets, I fear very much that the United States elite is capable of taking us all down with it. And that's why I think the real security challenge, I'm absolutely serious about, is no hyperbole. The most important one is contain the United States right now.
Yeah, I hate to drag out the discussion, but there was a paper I read by Ron Unz at the Unz Review. I don't know if you gentlemen follow it. And he was of the opinion that precisely because the Washington warmongers have so overextended themselves and been so bullying the rest of the world, that they have brought the rest of the world to wanting to join the Eurasian alliance between Russia and China. And precisely because all of these other non-aligned nations are more or less on Russia-China's side, that this has actually probably avoided a war between China and the United States and bypassed the whole problem of Thucydides' trap. Because the United States all of a sudden finds itself isolated, contained, to your point, and not having the military power to actually do anything insofar as the China situation is concerned. And I think it's a very provocative idea. But anyway, I'm going to have the last word, I suppose. I want you all to please follow Alexander at the Duran and at his channel on YouTube. The links are in the description below. Alexander, thank you so much for coming on. I so appreciate it.
My great pleasure.
And Tarik, his link to his Twitter is below. Is there anywhere else you want people to follow you, or at Twitter can they find other links to your work? Or
Twitter is the best.
Twitter's the best, yeah. So the links are in the description below. Chat, do me a favor and hit us all with a +1 before we wind down the broadcast. I want to thank my guests. Please, guys, stick around after I end the show just for some final words. And yeah,
thank you.
Chat, thanks so much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll catch you next time.